Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are really going for it, plunging into the deep end, you could say. We're looking at the philosophical foundations laid down from late antiquity through the medieval period. And this isn't just, a history lesson. We're talking about intellectual archaeology. Our mission, really, is to trace these incredibly powerful foundational ideas. Things like, what is the soul? How do we know anything? What does it mean for something to exist? Where does law come from?
Right.
And we're tracking how these were debated, hammered out, refined across really diverse traditions: Byzantine, Arabic, Jewish, Latin.
Yeah, it's about finding the connections, the philosophical DNA that, well, still shapes how we think today.
Exactly. So we're aiming for synthesis here, understanding the arguments, the reasoning.
That's the goal. Forget just the timeline. Let's get into the philosophical engine, How did they take old tools, Plato, Aristotle, and use them to tackle new questions, often theological ones? And what's the residue? What are we still grappling with?
Okay, I like that. The philosophical engine. Let's fire it up. Where better to start than where metaphysics bumps up against theology, the quest for the intelligible world, maybe through Neoplatonism?
Sounds good. Because right before the medieval period really kicks off, within Neoplatonism, you have this fundamental split, a real disagreement that echoes down the centuries.
You mean Porphyry versus Iamblichus?
Exactly.
Right.
And it's not just a minor academic spat. It's about the whole point of being a philosopher and, crucially, the value of the physical world itself.
Okay, break that down for us. Porphyry first.
Porphyry took a very, ascetic line, a deep disdain for the material world. For him, the philosopher's job was ascent, purely intellectual ascent. Meaning you cut yourself off from the body, from the physical. And that led him to reject theurgy.
Theurgy, that's the ritual stuff, right? Trying to get gods to manifest in statues, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Rituals involving physical media. Porphyry thought it was completely useless for a true philosopher. Purification had to be intellectual, internal, not messing about with rituals and matter.
Okay, so pure mind over matter. But then Iamblichus comes along and seemingly reverses course. Seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it was deliberate. Iamblichus actively pushed back against Porphyry's, you might say, intellectual snobbery, his disdain for nature.
So Iamblichus saw value in the physical.
He absolutely did. He argued the physical world wasn't just a trap or a distraction. It was the vital link to the divine. So for him, theurgy, rituals, even worshiping specific gods, he drew a lot on ancient Egyptian traditions. These were valuable tools.
Tools for what, exactly?
For resacralizing the world of nature. That was his term, or the concept anyway. Turning matter and ritual back into bridges, connecting the cosmos back to the intelligible realm that Porphyry wanted to leave behind entirely.
Interesting. So one pulls away, the other tries to reconnect through the physical. And this leads us to Proclus, head of the School of Athens.
Directly. Proclus was heavily influenced by Iamblichus's approach, this link between Platonism and, pagan religion. And he set out to systematize it all with incredible rigor.
How so? What did his system look like?
It's this amazing, intricate architecture. Think triads. He developed this system where the three Neoplatonic hypostases, the one, intellect, soul, are systematically divided and subdivided through interconnected triads.
Okay, triad.
And flowing from the ultimate source, the unparticipated one, you have these henads, multiple divine unities.
So it's like a logical breakdown of divinity, almost mathematical.
That's exactly the feel of it. His Elements of Theology is the key text. It's structured as 211 propositions, each one followed by a proof. He's trying for demonstrative certainty, deriving the entire structure of reality from just a few self-evident principles.
Wow. Can you give an example? How does that logical structure connect to, say, the actual gods?
Well, take Proposition 11.
Yeah.
All things that participate in the one are themselves unities. He uses steps like this to build outwards, deriving the divine intellects, souls, all the way down to matter. But here's the crucial part. Those derivative henads, those divine unities, Proclus explicitly identified them with the gods of the traditional pagan pantheon, Jupiter, Apollo, and so on. So he's taking polytheism and structuring it into this single, cohesive, logically necessary system.
That's quite an intellectual feat, building a logical proof for paganism in a way.
Absolutely. But here's the twist, the real kicker. This incredibly rigorous, sophisticated pagan philosophical system, it ended up having its biggest influence under a completely different banner.
How does that happen?
Through one of the most successful cases of intellectual disguise ever, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite.
Pseudo-Dionysius, meaning not the real Dionysius.
Almost certainly not. Likely a Syrian monk writing maybe late 5th, early 6th century. but he attributed his writings to Dionysius, the guy St. Paul converted in Athens, mentioned in the book of Acts.
Ah, so instant apostolic street cred.
Unbeatable authority, really. And because everyone thought these texts were practically from the time of the apostles, Proclus's complex Neoplatonic machinery, the hierarchies, the emanations, the systematic structure, gets absorbed wholesale into Christian thought.
Wow. So Proclus's ideas sneak in under a Christian cloak.
Completely. When these works get translated into Latin, around the 9th century, they become this vital bridge, hugely influential in the West. The giggers like Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, they wrote massive commentaries on Pseudo-Dionysius.
So Proclus's framework, designed to explain the pagan gods, ends up being used to explain Christian angels and God's relation to creation.
Precisely. It's maybe the ultimate irony. A pagan system becomes foundational for Christian metaphysics, all thanks to this attributed authorship, an incredible story of ideas surviving in disguise.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. From the structure of the universe to how we actually know things. Epistemology. There's this persistent problem from Aristotle, right? Where do our first principles come from? Those basic truths we build everything else on.
Yeah, Posterior Analytics, Book 2, Chapter 19. It's a classic. The standard answers were Plato's recollection, we knew it before birth, just need reminding, or Aristotle's potential knowledge, we're born with capacity, and experience builds it up.
But in the Byzantine world, we get a distinctly Christian take from Eustratius, trying to make it fit theology.
Exactly. Eustratius wants to align epistemology with the idea of a perfect creation. His argument is striking. The human soul, because it's created perfect by God, is actually born with full actual knowledge of first principles.
Full actual knowledge from birth. But, I mean, babies don't seem to know much geometry.
Right. That's the obvious objection. Eustratius's answer isn't that the knowledge is missing, but that it's obscured.
Obscured how?
By the body. Because humans naturally lean towards the senses, towards a material life, our intellectual eye is clouded, as he puts it. Bodily impulses, distractions, they cover up the innate knowledge.
Ah, I see. So learning, experience, instruction, they aren't giving us the knowledge.
No, they're clearing the way. They guide the soul, remove the obstructions, and help bring that already present perfect knowledge into our conscious awareness. It lets us finally ascend to those first principles we technically knew all along. It's a neat way to keep the soul perfect at creation while still explaining why we need to learn.
That really ties epistemology to theology. Okay, sticking with the Byzantines, but moving later, say 14th century, there's this Paleologan Renaissance, right? A period of more intellectual independence.
Yes, after the Byzantines retook Constantinople, there was renewed access to classical texts, a bit more stability, and definitely more intellectual freedom. Thinkers felt more able to, well, critique the big names, even Aristotle.
Like Nicephorus Chomnos.
Chomnos is interesting. He used philosophy rigorously, but often to demonstrate truths that were already accepted theologically, using logic to shore up faith, you could say.
And his student, Theodore Metachites, he seems even more critical, almost pessimistic about knowledge.
Yeah, Metachites represents a kind of epistemological pessimism. He really went after Aristotle, basically accusing him of intellectual arrogance, of promising scientific certainty about things like, say, the stars or deep physics, where Metachites thought certainty was impossible for humans. He called it intellectual vanity.
Suggesting philosophers should know their limits.
Exactly. And his student, Nicephorus Gregoris, pushed it even further. In his dialogue Florentius, he explicitly takes on and questions Aristotle's views. You see a real critical distance developing that maybe wasn't there before.
This willingness to critique sets the stage for someone like Photios tackling Aristotle's fundamental categories, specifically the category of substance.
Yes, this is really getting into the weeds, but it's crucial. Aristotle's definition of substance was quite broad. Photios, however, thinking partly about the logical needs of explaining the Trinity, insisted that substance proper should not admit of a more and a less.
Meaning substance can't come in degrees. You can't be more or less human.
That's the idea. If the core essence could vary, it creates theological problems, especially around shared natures. So Photios needed a stricter definition.
And his solution was?
To narrow it down. He restricted substance properly, so-called, only to the most specific species, what logicians call the infime species, like man, but not the broader genus animal.
Why that specific level?
Because it aligned with how the Church Fathers often talked. When discussing Christology, they tended to use substance, nature, and form almost interchangeably. and usually referring to that most specific level, like humanity. They save hypostasis individual person for the particular instances. So Photius' logical move mirrored theological language, ensuring a core substance was uniform for all members.
Okay, that's clever. And Photios also tackled that other classic problem from Porphyry's Isagage. Are universals like man physical things or not? Corporeal or incorporeal?
Right, the old puzzle. If man is incorporeal but Socrates is a man, then Socrates is somehow partly incorporeal. Doesn't work. If man is corporeal, how does one universal thing exist as many bodies?
So Photios is way out.
It was subtle. For the genera and species of bodies, he said they're neither strictly bodies, no mass, nor strictly incorporeal, like, say, an angel. He called them corporeal in a special sense. Somatica.
Somatica, meaning
Indicative of bodies. They exist in definitions and logoi, they lack mass, but their whole point is to refer to physical things. They're like signposts, pointing to the world of bodies. It avoids making Socrates incorporeal, but still gives universals a status beyond just being words.
these debates, especially about universals, they definitely didn't stay confined to the East, did they? They explode in the Latin West.
Oh, absolutely. The problem of universals becomes maybe the central metaphysical battleground in the Latin tradition, often framed by Aristotle's categories, that four-part ontological square. You get these really strong opposing camps.
Like the realists.
Exactly. You have immanent realism. Thinkers like Anselm, Odo of Cambrai. Their view is that universal entities like humanity actually exist in the individual things.
So humanity is really present inside Socrates and inside Plato.
Yes. And for them, that universal essence is all the substantial being of the individual. It's common to all members of the species. They had that famous line, nullus homo alio hominem humanior est, no man is more human than another.
Which implies?
It implies that, from the perspective of substance, all men are one man. Individuality, your uniqueness, is explained purely by your specific bundle of accidents, where you are, when you are, your size, color, etc. Non-essential properties.
Wow. So my identity is just the surface details on a shared core substance. That's quite a thought. What was the pushback? The nominalists.
The ontological particularists, or nominalists, yes. They flipped it completely. Everything that exists is essentially particular, full stop. Individuality isn't something added, it's the basic fact of reality.
Who were the key figures here?
The early radical voice was Roscelin. His view was famously dismissed as flatus vocis, just a puff of air and a mission of sound.
Meaning universals are just words.
Exactly. No real existence outside the mind or language. We group things under the same name, man, because they resemble each other, but there's no single manness they share. Unity comes purely from predication, using the same name correctly.
That sounds almost too simple. How do you explain why the predication is correct without some shared property?
That was the challenge. And it led to Peter Abelard's more sophisticated approach, kind of semantic compromise.
How did Abelard thread that needle?
Abelard agreed that only particulars are real things. Universality belongs only to words. But to explain why we apply words like man correctly to many individuals, he introduced these intermediate items, things like status, condition, or dictum propositiones, what a proposition states.
And these status or dicta, what are they?
They are explicitly non-thing items. They aren't nothing, but they aren't physical particulars either. They have being only in thought or as the content of statements. They allow Abelard to explain resemblance and correct predication without having to say universals are real substances floating around somewhere. It shifts the problem towards language and logic, away from pure metaphysics.
Okay, let's pivot again now to the incredible intellectual developments in the Arabic and Jewish traditions, especially around God's nature. Sai's Gaon, for instance, trying to classify God's attributes.
Sa'adi's project was fascinating. He was trying to square Jewish scripture with Aristotelian logic and the very strict Unitarianism of the Islamic theological school called Mutazilite Kalam, a tough balancing act.
How'd he manage it? With categories of attributes?
Yes. He proposed two main types to preserve God's absolute unity while still accounting for the descriptions in the Torah.
Okay, what are the two?
First, attributes of essence. These describe what God is. Things like knowing, powerful, living, one, inimitable. Sa'adi stressed these add no multiplicity to God. They're not separate qualities added on. They're just different ways our minds grasp the single unified reality of God as the creator. You get them all at once when you grasp his necessary existence.
Okay, essence attributes don't imply complexity. What's the second type?
Attributes of action. These describe what God does, being merciful, vengeful, just, etc. These were less problematic for unity because Sa'adi argued they refer obliquely to God's actions in the world. They describe his effects on creation, not his internal unchanging essence.
So they're about his relationship to the world, not his inner being.
Precisely. And this tied into Saadia's very strong epistemological view about God. He was quite empirical about it.
How so?
He insisted we only know God exists because the physical world clearly needs an external cause. His line was something like, "No means of proof is available that is not on the basis of creation." You start with the world and reason back to God. You don't start with some innate idea of him.
That focus on absolute unity, though, must have caused friction with Christian thinkers trying to explain the Trinity.
It certainly did. And you see figures like the Christian logician Yahya ibn Nadi using Aristotelian logic against that kind of radical unity defended by column thinkers like Saadia.
Using Aristotle to defend the Trinity, how?
Ibn Nadi mounted this clever logical argument. He said, look, if you insist God is so utterly unique that he shares nothing in common with anything else, not even a shared logical property, you end up in absurdity.
For example?
His example was simple but effective. God and a human being must at least share the property of not being a horse. Even negative properties create some common ground, some shared logical space.
That's a neat logical point. So if absolute dissimilarity leads to absurdity,
then God must be, in some sense, one, and in another sense, multiple or complex. Ibn Adi argued that attributes we see reflected in the world, generosity, wisdom, power, must correspond to something real in God, proving a kind of multiplicity within the divine nature.
which is the opposite of Saadia's conclusion.
Exactly. Saadia criticized Christians precisely for thinking attributes like knowing, powerful, living could imply a genuine multiplicity, the Trinity.
Yeah.
Ibn Adi embraced that complexity using logic to argue it was necessary.
Okay, now we absolutely have to talk about Avicenna, Ibn Sina, a giant figure whose ideas really shifted the landscape. Let's start with his theory of mind and how we get universal concepts.
Avicenna's psychology is incredibly detailed. He maps out these 5 internal senses. You get the common sense integrating external data, then image storing and image forming faculties, then estimation, which is crucial. It grasps nonsensible meanings like the danger a sheep perceives in a wolf, and finally memory.
That's a complex inner world. How does that machinery lead to abstract universal knowledge?
It's a 2-stage process for Avicenna. First, our own internal faculties, especially the cogitative faculty, work on the particular images or forms we get from experience. They abstract, analyze, compare, basically preparing the ground.
Okay, preparation. Then what?
Once the human intellect has done this preparatory work correctly, it triggers an influx from outside. The corresponding universal concept flows into the mind from a separate, external, eternally active intelligence, the agent intellect.
Whoa, so we don't create the universal concept, triangle, or humanity ourselves.
Not according to Avicenna. Our intellect is only potential. The agent intellect is always actually thinking all the universal forms. Our mental work is like setting up the premises of a syllogism. When the premises are right, the preparation is done, the conclusion, the influx of the universal, follows necessarily.
So knowledge of universals comes from this external source, guaranteeing its truth.
That's the idea. It explains why true universal knowledge is necessary and infallible, because it originates from this perfect external intellect, not just from our fallible individual minds.
That psychological model is fascinating. And it feeds directly into his even more famous contribution, the distinction between essence and existence.
Yes, the mahiyat, essence or quiddity, versus wujud, existence, distinction.
Yeah.
This was truly revolutionary.
Why? What was the standard view before him?
Especially in some Kalam circles, essence and existence were often seen as fused. Things just are. Avicenna argued forcefully they must be distinct. Existence, he said, is fundamentally an accident that happens to an essence.
An accident. How so?
Think about defining something, say a triangle. You define its essence. 3-sided planar figure, angles add up to 180 degrees. The definition tells you what it is. It doesn't tell you that it exists. Existence has to be something added to that essence. For God, existence is necessary to his essence. For everything else, existence is contingent, added by an external cause.
And he tied this to different modes of existence.
Right. He distinguished existence in reality, physical existence, fiya alasha, from existence in the mind, mental conception, field tasawwur. The essence, say, humanity is defined the same way in both places, but the accidents attached to it differ.
Like?
In the physical world, the essence humanity has accidents like having a body, moving, being in a place. In the mind, that same essence has accidents like being universal, being a predicate, being thought about.
And this distinction had huge theological implications, like solving the problem of creation ex nihilo. What did God command be to if nothing existed?
Exactly. This distinction provides Avicenna's answer, looking ahead to his cosmology. Before physical creation, all essences existed with mental existence in God's mind. They were real concepts.
Yeah.
So God's command be, wasn't addressed to nothingness, but to these mentally existing essences, these potentials in the divine intellect, commanding them to take on physical existence.
So the essences were already there in God's mind, waiting to be actualized physically.
Precisely. It's an incredibly powerful philosophical move. And that distinction between essence and existence becomes absolutely foundational for centuries of scholastic philosophy in the West. Thomas Aquinas builds heavily on it.
Okay. Avicenna's ideas about the agent intellect and the mind clearly had profound ripple effects. Let's look at someone like Ibn Bajjah of Empes in Latin, who took these ideas towards a kind of philosophical mysticism and solitude.
Ibn Bajjah really developed Avicenna's epistemology into a path for the individual soul. He talks about etisal, or conjunction, union with the agent intellect.
How does one achieve this conjunction?
For Ibn Bajjah, it's a step-by-step intellectual purification. First, your own human intellect abstracts forms from matter like the form of circle from seeing round things. These abstracted forms exist in your imagination, still tied somewhat to particulars.
Okay. Step 1. Abstraction.
Step 2. The agent intellect then acts on these abstracted forms in your mind, purifying them further, stripping away all remaining connection to matter or imagination until you grasp the mere notion of form itself. Pure intelligibility.
And the peak of this process is
Knowing the agent intellect itself. Since the agent intellect is a separate, eternal, purely intelligible form, knowing it means achieving the highest possible human knowledge. And crucially for Ibn Bajjah, this means humans can potentially reach transcendental understanding without needing religious revelation.
So philosophy becomes the ultimate path, and religion is what?
He saw religion more as an exhortation to know al-Qad al-Ilm, a kind of societal guide, pointing people towards the true philosophical ascent, which is the real goal.
What happens to the individual philosopher when they achieve this union, this atisal with the agent intellect? Do they remain themselves?
This is where it gets radical.
Yeah.
Ibn Bajjah leans into the idea of impersonal immortality.
Impersonal, meaning you lose your identity.
Potentially, yes. Based on the Aristotelian principle that knowing something involves becoming like it or assimilated to it, by achieving conjunction with the agent intellect, your intellect becomes one with it and thus eternal.
Oh.
But the agent intellect is one and the same for all human beings. Right, so if everyone unites with the same single agent intellect, then in that ultimate state, all perfected human intellects are one. Individual, personal identity, tied to the body and its history, dissolves into this unified eternal consciousness.
That's a profound, maybe even unsettling vision of salvation. And it connects to his idea of the philosopher needing to be solitary, his rule of the solitary.
Tadbir al-Mutawahid, yes. It flows directly from this focus on individual intellectual ascent. Ibn Bajjah argued that achieving this philosophical goal requires intense focus and withdrawal, especially if you live in an imperfect or corrupt society.
Why the need for withdrawal?
Because ordinary society, politics, daily life, they're full of distractions, compromises, and demands that pull the philosopher away from the purely intellectual work needed for conjunction. So the Tadbir is essentially a guide for the aspiring philosopher on how to manage their life, detach from worldly concerns, and maximize their intellectual progress, even if the surrounding political situation is bad. It's a philosophy of focused withdrawal.
This drive for intellectual freedom, though, inevitably slams into that age-old problem: free will. How do you square human freedom, which seems necessary for morality, reward, punishment, with things like causal determinism, maybe even astrology, and especially God's perfect, unchanging knowledge of the future?
That is the perennial tension, isn't it? Medieval thinkers twisted themselves into knots over this.
Yes.
You get some really bold, contrasting solutions.
Like Gersonides, the Jewish philosopher. He tried to save freedom by, well, tweaking God's knowledge.
He did. Levi ben Gershom, or Gersonides, did a
Right.
radical move. To guarantee genuine human freedom, he argued that God's knowledge, while perfect, is limited in scope.
Limited how? What doesn't God know?
Gersonides proposed that God knows the universal order perfectly, the laws of nature, the movements of the stars, which he thought influenced general tendencies, universals, general principles. But God does not know future contingent particulars. Specifically, he doesn't know which specific choice a free human agent will make in the future.
So God knows all the possibilities, but not the actual outcome of a free choice.
Exactly. Because if God knew the outcome with certainty, Gersonides reasoned, then that outcome would be necessary, fixed, and the choice wouldn't truly be free. By limiting God's knowledge in this specific way, he preserves genuine contingency and human freedom. He argued this didn't diminish God, but rather glorified him as the creator of a world with real freedom.
That's a fascinating, if potentially controversial, solution. How did others respond? Did everyone agree?
Oh, definitely not. You have thinkers like Crescus who went in the complete opposite direction, towards a pretty thorough determinism. Crescus heavily influenced Spinoza later on.
So Crescus embraced determinism, no free will.
He basically rejected metaphysical free will, the idea of the will as a power that could genuinely choose between alternatives, all things being equal. Crescus argued that God does know everything, particulars, the infinite, the future, including exactly which possibility will happen.
So how does choice work for Crescus then? Is it just an illusion?
Not quite an illusion, but it's determined. For Crescus, your choice is the necessary outcome of your character, your dispositions, your knowledge, and the circumstances you're in. The action flows necessarily from the agent, but the agent's willing itself is determined.
But wait, didn't Crescus still list free choice as one of the fundamental principles of Judaism? How does that work if he's a determinist?
That's the incredible tension. It shows how central the concept of choice was, religiously and ethically. He had to keep the term, but effectively redefined it. For him, choice seems to mean acting according to your own internal nature and deliberation, even if that nature and deliberation are themselves fully determined. You are the source of the action, just not an uncaused source.
It really highlights the conceptual knots they were trying to untie. And you mentioned Hobbes, a later shift.
Yeah, it's worth noting that much later, the whole definition of freedom shifts dramatically. Thinkers like Hobbes basically redefine liberty, not as some internal metaphysical power of the will to choose otherwise, the medieval liberty of exercise or specification, but simply as the absence of external impediments to doing what you want to do. If nothing stops you from walking out the door, you walk freely, even if your desire to walk was determined. It's a completely different way of framing the problem, which sort of sidesteps the whole medieval debate.
Okay, let's shift focus again, this time to logic and language itself. The medievals had intense debates about what makes our statements true. What corresponds in reality to a true proposition like Socrates is sitting? Modern philosophers might call them states of affairs, or SOAs.
Right, this was a huge ontological battleground. What kind of things, if any, are the truth makers for our sentences or the objects of our beliefs? You get roughly three main camps.
Let's start with reism. Sounds like thingism.
Pretty much. Reists try to keep their ontology very lean, populated only by concrete things. So when you believe truly that Socrates is sitting, the object of your belief isn't some abstract Socrates is sittingness. It's just Socrates, the actual thing, in his actual seated state. Walter Chatton was a proponent of the object is the thing signified.
Okay, only concrete things exist. But what about the eliminativists, like Ockham or Burdon? They seem even more radical.
They are. Ockham and Burdon agreed that true propositions need truth makers. Something in reality makes them true. But they denied that this truth maker needs to be some special, complex entity like a state of affairs.
So what makes Socrates as a man true for Ockham?
Simply Socrates and the quality of humanity inherent in him. You don't need an extra thing called Socrates being a man floating around in reality. That's ontologically extravagant, Ockham would say. The ordinary things and their properties are enough. No complex truth makers required.
Very economical. What's the third view? Say generism. Sounds like of its own kind.
Exactly. This view posits that the correlates of propositions or beliefs belong to a unique ontological category. They're not ordinary things, but they're not nothing either. Think back to Abelard's dicta.
Ah, the non-thing items that exist in thought.
Right. Or later, Gregory of Rimini talked about complex significabilia, complexly signifiable things. These are abstract entities, like the content of the proposition Socrates is sitting. They serve as the precise objects of belief or knowledge, giving a structured account of logic and meaning without populating the physical world with weird abstracta like the reists feared, but also without denying that propositions have distinct contents, which was a challenge for strict eliminativism.
This ties back nicely to William of Ockham again. His nominalism wasn't just about denying universals. It was a whole philosophical program, right?
Yeah.
Ontology, semantics, how we think.
Absolutely. Occam's nominalism is remarkable for its completeness. He didn't just critique realism. He offered a detailed alternative. His critique was sharp. If universals like humanity were real extramental things, there'd just be extra entities cluttering up the world. Why multiply beings unnecessarily?
Occam's razor in action.
Pretty much. And he argued if humanity was a separate thing from individual humans, then presumably Socrates could exist without humanity, which is absurd. So universals can't be separate substances.
So if universality isn't out there in the world, where is it? Just in language.
Primarily in the mind. For Ockham, he developed this theory of concepts or mental words. Conceptus or intentiones anime. These are natural signs in the mind that stand for multiple individuals.
Mental words.
Yeah. And his key semantic move was to argue that spoken or written words, like man, get their meaning because they are subordinated to these naturally significant concepts in the mind of the person who first imposed the word.
The original user of the word.
Sort of. The focus shifts from the immediate speaker's intention to the underlying mental concept that the word was originally linked to. This makes the concept the primary bearer of universal meaning, grounding language in thought, and thought ultimately in the experience of particulars. It's a powerful, internally consistent nominalist system.
Okay, let's move into the ethical realm now. Thomas Aquinas. He's got Aristotle's virtue ethics. On one hand, right action flows from the good person's character and judgment, but he's also got natural law fixed, universal moral rules. How does he possibly reconcile those?
That's a central question in understanding Aquinas. It looks like a tension. Is morality about being a certain kind of person or following universal rules? Aquinas brilliantly synthesizes them.
How?
He starts with natural law. He argues the very first principle, good is to be done and pursued and evil is to be avoided, is known intuitively by everyone through what he calls synderesis.
Synderesis, like an innate moral compass.
Kind of. It's an infallible habit of the intellect that grasps the most basic principle of practical reason. It's part of being rational. Even a deeply vicious person still operates under this fundamental orientation towards the good, even if they misidentify what's truly good.
Okay, so everyone knows the basic rule, but that's very general. How do we get to specific actions?
That's where virtue, specifically prudentia, comes in. Prudence is the intellectual virtue that allows us to correctly figure out the means to achieve the good ends grasped by synderesis in complex particular situations.
Ah, so synderesis gives the goal, prudence finds the path.
Exactly. The universal law exists independently, grasped by synderesis. But applying that law correctly, choosing the right action here and now, requires the developed character and sound judgment of the prudent, virtuous person. So Aquinas isn't a pure virtue theorist. The law is primary. But virtue is absolutely necessary to live out the law correctly. They work together.
That makes sense. Finally, let's look at the concept of rights isolius itself. It seems like the medieval period saw different kinds of rights emerge, which feels very relevant today.
Definitely. You can broadly distinguish three categories developing. First, simple legal rights or positive law. Rights granted by a specific ruler, law, or custom. These can be changed or revoked. Thinkers like John of Paris were already trying to sort out different kinds of isolius belonging to different institutions, church versus state resisting, simple ideas of one supreme authority holding all rights.
Okay, legal rights. What's next?
Natural rights. These are understood more as powers or freedoms grounded in human nature itself, in our dominion over our own minds and bodies as rational beings created by God. These are often seen as inherent, maybe even inalienable.
And the third type?
What we might now call human rights, though the terminology is later, rights that belong to a person simply because they are human, regardless of their status, location, or circumstances. The idea of universal dignity grounding certain claims starts to gain traction, even if the social structures didn't always reflect it.
Now, there's a big debate, especially involving the historian Michel Villey, about where our modern idea of subjective rights comes from, right as a personal power or liberty. And he points the finger at Ockham.
Villey made a very influential, though controversial, argument. He traced the origin of subjective natural rights, the idea of liberty as a power residing in the individual will, directly to William of Ockham in the 14th century.
And why Ockham? What was the context?
It was all tied up in the huge debate over Franciscan poverty. The Franciscans claimed to follow Christ by renouncing all property, both individually and collectively, keeping only the simple usus facti of necessary things.
Okay.
But Pope John XXII attacked this. He argued essentially that using something consumable like food necessarily implied ownership, or at least a right to use it that couldn't be renounced. You couldn't separate use from right in that way.
So the Pope was denying the very possibility of the Franciscan ideal.
Exactly. To defend the Franciscans, Ockham had to argue that a right, sisus, could be understood differently. He defined sisus in certain contexts as a subjective power or licit power, potestas licita, conferred by law or agreement, a liberty to act or claim something. And crucially, such a power could be renounced. You could have the use of something without claiming the right power of ownership or even the specific right to use it legally against others.
So the difference is in position.
It did. But Villi argued this move was fateful. By defining Scotus primarily as a subjective power inhering in the individual will, Ockham, according to Villi, fundamentally shifted Western thought away from the older idea of objective natural right, natural law as a system of duties derived from the cosmic order, and paved the way for modern individualistic rights theories based on personal liberty and claims. The whole debate really turns on how you define that little word, Scotus.
That's fascinating how a debate about poverty could reshape legal philosophy.
It really is. These theological and political arguments often forced fundamental philosophical rethinking.
Okay, let's try to wrap this incredible journey up. We've covered so much ground.
We really have. And looking back, what stands out is just the sheer intellectual energy and, frankly, the necessity behind these projects. They weren't just passively receiving ancient Greek ideas. They were actively wrestling with them, reshaping them, sometimes disguising them, like Proclus through Pseudo-Dionysius.
Right.
Sometimes making revolutionary distinctions, like Avicenna separating essence and existence, which just changed everything. And sometimes engaging in radical critique and reconstruction, like Ockham tearing down realism and building his nominalist system, partly driven by that need to defend Franciscan poverty.
So the big takeaway, what does all this medieval complexity mean for us?
I think it means the medieval era wasn't some dark age merely copying the ancients. It was forging new tools, fundamentally restructuring concepts to solve persistent philosophical and theological puzzles. Innate knowledge, divine attributes, personal identity after death, the nature of rights.
And the tools they developed, Avicenna's mental existence, Eustratius's obscured knowledge, Occam's nominalism and focus on concepts, these aren't just historical curiosities.
Not at all. They form the subtle, often unacknowledged conceptual grammar underlying so many of our own debates today in metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, law, even cognitive science. The foundations are deeper and more complex than we often realize.
Okay, let's leave our listeners with a final thought. Going back to Eustratius and his idea that our innate knowledge of first principles is obscured by bodily impulses, by the pull of the senses clouding the intellectual eye. Well, think about our world now, this incredibly specialized, often disembodied digital information sphere we live in. Could it be that the sheer volume, the fragmentation, the constant stimulation and distraction of modern information overload, is that just a new collective, maybe more sophisticated form of bodily impulse?
A digital clouding of the intellectual eye.
Perhaps. Is it making it harder, not easier, to perceive those fundamental, universal truths Eustratius thought were innate? Is information overload actually hindering our access to first principles? Something to definitely mull over as you navigate the complexities of knowing anything today. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll explore more next